So Kate, talk to us a little bit. I mean, you've had an incredible career so far, and I'm sure there's so much more to come. Talk to us about being a female sports journalist. Was this something that you had wanted to do from an early age, or was it something that just kind of came to be?
No, I always wanted to be a writer, and when I got out of college, I realized that you can't just sit around writing a book unless you have a second job, a slash job, as they would say, writer slash. And I figured, why not get into a profession that allowed me to continue to hone the craft of writing while making some money to then write books. So the dream was always to write books, not necessarily to be in sports media or be a journalist. And eventually I got to a place where I was able to do both.
So I was going to say, for maybe the young ladies that are out here that are looking to maybe get into a profession that may be more male dominated. I know I've kind of struggled with that myself as a meteorologist. Like, what advice would you give to these young girls?
I was thinking about that because when I was listening to you talk about your story about being a meteorologist, probably until that kid said that to you, like, why would you do that? It never occurred to you. And it did not occur to me that it was a male-dominated field because I grew up playing basketball. And so I played pickup everywhere. And almost always I would be the only girl, but I never thought to myself, oh, I'm the only girl. And so I can only answer that question in retrospect. Like, now I've seen certain variables that I had to deal with that some of my colleagues didn't, but I guess I would attribute like a naivete to not even considering that I was a woman in a male-dominated field. And certainly that, I don't know, that's not necessarily the best thing to do, is just to be ignorant and have your blinders on, but I just always thought, I go play pickup and there's mostly guys, and I want to be a sports writer and there's mostly guys. I didn't think of it ever as a barrier.
Well, I was going to say, and being an athlete and playing basketball, talk to us about kind of the pressures that you felt, especially once you started playing in college.
Yeah, and this does dovetail. I think you guys have a copy of the book, What Made Maddie Run, that's on the table out there. I think transition periods are more tricky than I think we understand as we're growing up. And that transition to college, and I think even for someone who's not playing sports, that transition to college is much trickier than we think. And then you add in a lot of the pressures of the emotional and physical stress of playing a college sport, and it was very challenging. It was challenging to figure out what I loved and what I was passionate about within the game when you're in this pressure cooker environment now of 2-a-day practices. And so that transition to me was very difficult. I tried to quit basketball. I had to call my parents every day, asking for their help. And so writing this book allowed me to actually reflect on that time and pull out some insight from what everyone else might be going through during those transitions as well.
Well, I think that's so huge what you mentioned about, reaching out, because I know I had that transition of going to college. I mean, it's something completely new. And I remember I was literally on the phone with my mom, I swear, multiple times a day, just having her kind of like talk me off the ledge. Now, I haven't personally read What Made Maddie Run. Not yet, because I haven't had a copy of the book, but I'm going to get it since it's here. But
I'll text you in a week and make sure that
okay, and I am going to. But I've watched a bunch of videos and interviews that you have done. For folks that don't know, give us just a quick kind of overview of the book and the struggles, because I think that a lot of the struggles that Maddie's faced is something that we can all relate to.
And that was really why we wanted to do the book. So the book is a story of a young woman who struggled with anxiety and depression in the transition to college. She was a college athlete at the University of Pennsylvania. She had played soccer and track in high school, and then was lucky enough to be able to compete in track at UPenn. But that transition and a number of other variables that we discuss in the book, having to do with genetic history of anxiety and depression in her family, social media, a lot of these variables, they really embedded in her a struggle that was deeper than just this is a tough transition, which we were lucky enough to go through. And she took her own life during her freshman year. And so the book really tries to unpack for kids and for parents what some of those variables were, because that's not a predetermined outcome. That's not unavoidable. And so trying to pull those apart for everyone so they can be more aware as they walk through life.
Well, I think this opens another discussion about mental illness, about anxiety, about depression. For those of you that have been here before, I mean, I've opened up candidly about it. I have a family history of mental illness, so I've always been very cognizant of how I'm feeling, my emotions and whatnot. How do you know when, you're just kind of dealing with the average everyday challenges that we all are, and then when maybe there are some signs that maybe you should seek professional help?
Yeah, I mean, whenever I'm talking about this book, I always try to be like, I am not a mental health professional. And I guess technically I'm a professional journalist, but even that sometimes can come into question. So there's certain questions where I'm like, you need to have someone in your life who is they've studied that and they can answer that question so that I don't give bad advice, because I feel like I'm an expert at understanding the cultural issues at play, but not always some that transition into more of like what you need an MD to answer.
And I completely agree. And I think it's also just always be so aware of, your friends and how they're acting. And if you ever notice any changes, reach out to them. I also wanted to talk about social media, because I think that is something that every single one of us can all relate to. And you talk about it in the book about Maddie, and how we always put, the good things on social media, but sometimes, we're all internally struggling, and then when you see that, you're like, oh my gosh, this person has a perfect life. I wanted to mention also my co-anchor, Autrey Godfrey, who was supposed to be here today. Unfortunately, she had a family emergency and wasn't able to be here, but she has a line that I love. Don't compare your life to someone else's highlight reel, because that is exactly what that Instagram and Snapchat feed is.
Yeah. I mean, I could spend a very long time on social media, but the first thing I always try to do is not make it seem for, younger people that like, all you guys do is look at your phone, because that's not what it is. I personally believe I have an addiction to my phone, so it's not like, young people these days. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the technology that has come into our lives that is addictive, and by its very design is meant to be addictive. And so for social, there's a couple different things at play. One is the amount of it now that we're consuming and how that impacts our brains, and that's everybody, not just kids, although I would assume, kids are more susceptible because you're growing up and you're malleable. So there's the concept of what we're putting online to project this ideal experience versus understanding that everyone else is doing the same thing. And when it came to Madison, that was the disconnect, because she would frequently say, if somebody was like, but you look so happy at that party, or your Instagram feed looks amazing, just like I would expect your freshman year in college, and then she would quickly be like, those are just pictures. And that would happen repeatedly, and yet she would verbalize all the time how when she consumed social media, she could not apply that logic to how everyone else was behaving on social media. And I deal with this all the time. I wrote this book, and I'll still go on social media and see people at weddings or on vacation, and I'm like, their lives are so much better than mine. And I think it's an unavoidable human instinct, but being aware that that's happening is key. And then the second thing, seriously, I could talk about this for 20 minutes, but you mentioned that when you were in college, you would talk to your mom all the time. So they did this study where they showed kids who were struggling, and they texted their loved one, things aren't going well. And then the person would write back, oh honey, I love you, it's gonna be okay. And there was no internal release of oxytocin, which is this chemical in our bodies that makes us feel soothed. And then when somebody was struggling and they called their mom or dad or their loved one, that was released in them. And so that doesn't mean I text all the time. It doesn't mean don't text. It just means be aware that that isn't the kind of human connection you think you're getting. That when you're actually talking, my mom calls me all the time now, and she's like, remember that study? Now you need to talk to me twice a day. You need to hear my voice. That human connection actually does something physical in our bodies, and it's not just some throwaway line of like, call your parents instead of text them.
Yeah, and I think that that's so huge, is to reach out to whoever that is in your life, whether that be a parent, a godparent, a good friend, a mentor, to have those people to reach out to. And I think that that's one of the biggest things, is we need to erase this stigma that you know, and especially with the social media, because I personally will sit there and I won't even realize the amount of time that has gone by, and I'm like, what did I just do with the last 20 minutes of my life? I was going
20 minutes? That's a short amount of time.
Well, you know,
it'll be like an hour.
I'm a busy girl. I'm looking at weather models the rest of the time. No, but seriously, and I have to even catch myself because it's like, oh my gosh, I'm so lonely. I have no friends. Like everyone's going on these vacations, and I'm working all the time. So I guess what advice do you give for, you know, these young ladies that are sitting here?
The best advice really, and it's not necessarily related to social media, because I really do worry that it comes across as older person telling, it's like a cliche, you know, oh, the next, I really do
We're
worry.
not that old.
I'm 35 and that's now feeling older. I worry that it falls on deaf ears because it happens so much. If I'm like, you know, really read these studies and look at what it does to our brains, I'm not sure that helps. I think the bigger takeaway I hope from this book is that we often talk about mental illness or issues, and it seems like it's something that's happening over there often. And like every single person in this room, and I usually try to qualify what I say, like is going to have a point in their life where there's you're struggling in some way.
Yeah.
And that can't be when you're in those moments to think, what's wrong with me and nobody else deals with this. We need to have a better conversation to not be like, oh, mental illness over here in this corner, and more of a broader discussion that the brain can be a tricky place, and as you go through your life, there will be times when it is more challenging than other times. And when you're in those times, to know that your friend has almost certainly been through that as well, and feel more open to talk about the way our brains work in the same way we would talk about the way our bodies work.
Well, and I think that as far as the challenges go for a lot of us, those are good moments. You know, I think we also put this stigma of these challenging moments in our lives of, you know, that they're bad. They're so good. I mean, I always try to tell myself, was listening to a podcast one time, and the person, I can't remember which one it was, but it was like, okay, so this is the challenge that I'm facing right now. What am I going to learn from this? And I think just shifting that mindset a little bit can really be helpful for a lot of you.